sometimes the most dangerous assumption is thinking you know who you're dealing with. In a world where uniforms and appearances can deceive, where confidence can mask ignorance, and where one person's expertise can shatter another's arrogance, the truth has a way of surfacing in the most unexpected moments. What happens when a seasoned Marine instructor meets someone whose quiet competence hides years of precision training and battlefield experience? What unfolds when mockery meets mastery, and when the wrong person becomes the target of the wrong joke at exactly the wrong time? This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a decorated sniper whose unassuming appearance masked one of the most lethal skill sets in modern military history. It's about Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a training instructor whose ego wrote checks his abilities couldn't cash. And it's about a single moment on a firing range that would humble one person, vindicate another, and remind everyone present that respect is earned through action, not assumptions. In the military, there's an unwritten rule that experience speaks louder than rank, skill trumps swagger, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody expects. This is what happens when that rule gets tested in front of an audience, when pride collides with precision, and when one perfectly placed shot changes everything everyone thought they knew. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fort Bragg firing range as Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted the strap of her equipment bag. The October air carried that crisp bite that reminded everyone winter was approaching, and the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the training grounds like a metallic heartbeat. Sarah had been looking forward to this advanced marksmanship course for months, not because she needed the training, but because she rarely got the chance to shoot alongside other military personnel outside her specialized unit. At 28, Sarah had already completed 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. Her slight frame and quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate her, which had become both an advantage and a source of constant frustration. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches with shoulder-length black hair, typically pulled back in a regulation bun, she looked more like a logistics officer than someone who held the unofficial record for the longest confirmed kill shot in her unit's history. The Advanced Combat Marksmanship course was designed for experienced military personnel from various branches. Today's class included 12 participants: Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and a few Air Force Special Operations personnel. Sarah was the only woman in the group, something that had stopped bothering her years ago, but still seemed to fascinate everyone else. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez stood at the front of the group, clipboard in hand, surveying his students with the practiced eye of someone who had been running these courses for the better part of a decade. At 6 feet 2 inches with the kind of build that suggested countless hours in the gym, Rodriguez commanded attention through sheer physical presence. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the most experienced person in any room. "Listen up, people," Rodriguez called out, his voice cutting through the morning chatter. "This isn't some basic rifle marksmanship course. You're here because someone thinks you can shoot. My job is to find out if that someone was right, or if they were just being polite." A few chuckles rippled through the group. Sarah remained silent, her eyes fixed on the distant targets that dotted the range at various distances. She had reviewed the course materials the night before and knew they would be working with everything from standard M4 carbines to precision rifle systems. What interested her most were the long-range challenges scheduled for the afternoon session. Rodriguez continued his briefing, explaining the day's schedule and safety protocols. His manner was professional, but carried an undercurrent of skepticism, particularly when his gaze lingered on Sarah. She had encountered this before, instructors who seemed to question whether she belonged in advanced training courses. "We'll start with some diagnostic shooting to see where everyone stands," Rodriguez explained. "Then we'll move through various scenarios designed to challenge your accuracy, speed, and adaptability. The afternoon will focus on precision shooting at extended ranges." The group moved to the equipment station, where each participant would select their weapons for the morning session. Sarah approached the rack of M4 carbines, running her hands over several rifles before selecting one that felt balanced in her grip. She performed a functions check with practiced efficiency, examining the weapon with the kind of systematic thoroughness that spoke to extensive experience. "First time handling one of these?" The question came from Sergeant First Class Tom Bradley, a ranger who had been watching her inspection routine. "Not exactly," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "Just making sure everything's in order." Rodriguez had been observing the equipment selection process, making notes on his clipboard. He approached Sarah's position as she finished adjusting her rifle sights. "Lieutenant Chun, right?" he said, reading from his roster. "Signal Corps." "That's correct, Staff Sergeant." "Interesting. Don't usually see signal folks in advanced marksmanship courses." His tone wasn't exactly dismissive, but it carried a note of curiosity that bordered on skepticism. Sarah had learned long ago that explaining her actual specialization often raised more questions than it answered. Her official military occupational specialty listed her as Signal Corps, which was technically accurate but deliberately vague. Very few people outside her immediate chain of command knew about her secondary specialization as a sniper or her extensive combat experience. "The Army encourages cross-training," she replied simply. Rodriguez nodded, though his expression suggested he found the explanation unsatisfying. "Well, we'll see how the Signal Corps trains their people to shoot." The comment wasn't overtly hostile, but it carried enough implication to make several nearby participants glance in Sarah's direction. She had dealt with similar assumptions countless times before. Rather than respond, she simply nodded and continued preparing her equipment. The first shooting exercise was designed to establish baseline marksmanship skills. Each participant would engage targets at 100, 200, and 300 meters using iron sights. Rodriguez demonstrated the proper shooting positions and techniques, his movements precise and confident. "Remember, this isn't about showing off," he told the group. "It's about demonstrating consistent, repeatable accuracy. Take your time, focus on fundamentals, and let's see what you've got." One by one, the participants took their turns at the firing line. The Rangers and SEALs performed as expected, producing tight groups that demonstrated solid marksmanship training. The Air Force personnel showed respectable accuracy, though their groupings were slightly less consistent. Sarah waited her turn, observing each shooter's technique and noting the way Rodriguez provided feedback. He was knowledgeable and fair in his assessments, offering constructive criticism without being overly harsh. She found herself respecting his instructional approach, even as she sensed his continued skepticism about her presence. When her turn arrived, Sarah approached the firing line with calm efficiency. She assumed a prone position, adjusted her rifle, and took a moment to settle into her shooting stance. Through the iron sights, the 100-meter target appeared crisp and clear. Her first shot broke cleanly, followed by 4 more in rapid succession. The group fell silent as the target was retrieved for scoring. All 5 shots had struck within a 2-inch group, centered perfectly in the target's 10 ring. "Good shooting, Lieutenant," Rodriguez acknowledged, though his tone suggested mild surprise. Sarah moved to the 200-meter line without comment. Again, 5 shots produced a tight group that would have been impressive at any range, let alone 200 meters with iron sights. The 300-meter target presented more of a challenge, but her final group still measured less than 4 inches. Several of the other participants offered congratulations as Sarah cleared her weapon and stepped back from the firing line. Rodriguez made notes on his clipboard, his expression thoughtful. "That's some solid shooting," said Bradley, the ranger who had spoken to her earlier. "Where did you train?" "Various places," Sarah replied diplomatically. The morning continued with additional exercises focusing on shooting from different positions and engaging multiple targets. Sarah performed consistently well without appearing to dominate the course. She had learned that drawing too much attention early in training often created unnecessary complications. During the lunch break, the participants gathered in small groups to discuss the morning's activities. Sarah found herself somewhat isolated, not through any hostility from the others, but simply because she didn't fit neatly into any of the established social hierarchies. The Rangers clustered together, as did the SEALs and Air Force personnel. Rodriguez approached her as she reviewed the afternoon schedule. "Mind if I ask where you did your marksmanship training?" he said, his tone more curious than skeptical now. "Fort Benning, mostly," Sarah replied. "Some additional training at various schools." It was a truthful answer that revealed nothing significant. Every infantry officer attended training at Fort Benning, and various schools could mean anything from basic courses to the most advanced special operations training available. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "That was some impressive shooting this morning. Looking forward to seeing how you handle the precision rifle portion this afternoon." "Should be interesting," Sarah agreed. The afternoon session would feature precision shooting at ranges extending out to 800 meters. Participants would use dedicated sniper rifles equipped with high-powered scopes, engaging targets that simulated real-world combat scenarios. This was where Sarah expected her background to become more apparent, though she planned to maintain her low-profile approach. As the group prepared to move to the long-range portion of the course, Sarah couldn't help but notice Rodriguez watching her with increased interest. She suspected the afternoon session would prove more revealing than she had originally planned. The precision rifle range stretched out across a valley, with targets positioned at distances that would challenge even experienced marksmen. Sarah examined the available rifles, finally selecting a Remington 700 chambered in .308 Winchester. The weapon felt familiar in her hands, similar to the rifle she had used countless times in far more demanding circumstances. Rodriguez gathered the group around a spotting scope positioned on a raised platform. "The precision portion of this course is where we separate the marksmen from the snipers," he announced. "You'll engage targets from 400 to 800 meters under various conditions. Wind, mirage, and range estimation will all factor into your success or failure." He pointed to the distant targets, barely visible even through the scope. "These scenarios simulate real-world combat situations. You'll have limited time to acquire your target, calculate your shot, and engage. Miss, and in the real world, you might not get another chance." Sarah listened carefully, though much of what Rodriguez described was already familiar to her. She had made similar shots under actual combat conditions, often with additional stress factors like enemy fire or time-critical mission requirements. The first precision exercise required each participant to engage a target at 400 meters. Wind flags indicated a moderate crosswind, and atmospheric conditions created a slight mirage that would affect bullet trajectory. Rodriguez demonstrated the proper technique for reading environmental conditions and calculating the necessary adjustments. Once again, Sarah waited for her turn, observing how each participant approached the challenge. The performance varied significantly, with some shooters struggling to connect with their targets, while others managed respectable accuracy. When Sarah's turn arrived, she approached the rifle with the same calm efficiency she had demonstrated all morning. Through the scope, she could clearly see the target and the environmental indicators that would affect her shot. After a moment of calculation, she made her scope adjustments and settled into position. Her shot struck the target dead center. "Excellent shot," Rodriguez commented, genuine appreciation in his voice now. The exercises continued with increasingly challenging scenarios. Targets at 600 meters required more complex calculations and precise execution. At 800 meters, even small errors in judgment would result in complete misses. Sarah continued to perform at a level that impressed both the instructor and her fellow participants. Her shots were consistently accurate, and her technique appeared effortless. What she didn't reveal was that 800 meters was well within her comfort zone. She had successfully engaged targets at distances exceeding 1,200 meters during combat operations. As the afternoon progressed, Rodriguez's demeanor toward her shifted noticeably. His initial skepticism gave way to professional respect, and he began asking more pointed questions about her background. "I have to ask, Lieutenant," he said during a break between exercises, "your shooting suggests training beyond standard military marksmanship courses. Are you sure you're just Signal Corps?" Sarah smiled diplomatically. "I've had some additional opportunities for training." It was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain her low profile. Her consistent accuracy was drawing attention from everyone present, and she could see Rodriguez mentally reassessing his initial assumptions about her capabilities. The day's final exercise would prove to be the most challenging yet, setting up the confrontation that would define the remainder of the course. As Sarah prepared for what she assumed would be another successful shooting demonstration, she had no idea that Rodriguez's growing curiosity about her background was about to create a situation that would test far more than her marksmanship skills. The final exercise of the day was designed to be the ultimate test of the participants' abilities. Rodriguez had set up a complex scenario involving multiple targets at varying distances, each requiring different shooting techniques and calculations. The challenge would simulate a real-world combat situation where a sniper might need to engage several threats in rapid succession. "This is what separates the professionals from the enthusiasts," Rodriguez announced to the assembled group. "You'll have 5 targets ranging from 300 to 750 meters. Each target will be exposed for exactly 60 seconds before moving to the next. You'll need to acquire calculate, and engage each target within that window. Sarah studied the range through binoculars, mentally cataloging each target's position and the environmental factors that would affect each shot. The wind had picked up slightly since the afternoon began, creating additional challenges for the longer-range engagements. The scoring system rewards both accuracy and speed, Rodriguez continued. A perfect center hit within 30 seconds earns maximum points. Hits outside the 10 ring or shots taken after 45 seconds receive reduced scores. The first participant, a Navy SEAL named Petty Officer First Class Marcus Webb, approached the firing line. Webb was considered one of the best marksmen in his unit and had performed excellently throughout the day. His run through the course was methodical and precise, resulting in 4 solid hits and 1 marginal shot that still scored respectably. Outstanding work, Rodriguez commented as Webb's targets were scored. That's the kind of performance that saves lives in the field. One by one, the other participants took their turns. The Rangers performed as expected, with Bradley achieving 4 center hits and 1 miss. The Air Force personnel struggled with the time constraints, managing decent accuracy, but sacrificing speed for precision. As Sarah prepared for her turn, she noticed Rodriguez watching her with particular interest. His earlier skepticism had evolved into genuine curiosity about her capabilities. She suspected he was beginning to piece together clues about her actual background and training. "Ready when you are, Lieutenant," Rodriguez called out. Sarah approached the firing line and settled into position behind the Remington 700. Through the scope, she quickly identified the first target at 300 meters. The shot was straightforward, requiring minimal adjustment for wind or elevation. She fired within 15 seconds, striking the target dead center. The second target, at 450 meters, required more calculation. A crosswind had picked up, and she needed to account for bullet drop over the increased distance. Her shot broke cleanly at 28 seconds, again striking the center of the target. Target 3, at 550 meters, presented the first real challenge. The wind had shifted direction slightly, and atmospheric conditions were creating mirage effects that could throw off her calculations. Sarah took an extra moment to read the conditions before engaging. Her shot struck slightly off-center, but well within the scoring rings. The fourth target, at 650 meters, required the most complex calculations yet. Wind, elevation, and atmospheric pressure all factored into the shot. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, her mind processing variables and making adjustments with the kind of unconscious competence that comes from extensive experience. She fired at 38 seconds and watched her bullet strike dead center. The final target, at 750 meters, was barely visible even through the high-powered scope. Sarah took several seconds to study the conditions, noting wind indicators and atmospheric distortion. This was the kind of shot that separated true snipers from recreational marksmen. She made her final adjustments and squeezed the trigger at 42 seconds. Through the scope, she watched her bullet impact precisely in the center of the target. The range fell silent for a moment. Then, Rodriguez's voice cut through the quiet. "Perfect score. 5 center hits, all within time limits." The other participants gathered around to congratulate Sarah, though several seemed more stunned than celebratory. Webb, the SEAL who had achieved what everyone thought was an outstanding score, shook his head in amazement. "That was incredible shooting," he said. "I've never seen anyone run that course that clean." Rodriguez approached with his clipboard, making notes and clearly processing what he had just witnessed. His professional demeanor had shifted noticeably, and Sarah could see him trying to reconcile her performance with his assumptions about her background. "Lieutenant Shun," he said, his tone now carrying a note of formality that hadn't been present before. "That was exceptional marksmanship. Mind if I ask what kind of additional training you mentioned earlier?" Sarah realized that her cover was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Her performance had been too good, too polished, too indicative of specialized training. She tried to deflect with humor. "I guess I've been lucky today," she said with a slight smile. Rodriguez wasn't buying the modest deflection. His years of experience training military marksmen had taught him to recognize different levels of skill, and what he had just witnessed went far beyond standard military marksmanship training. "Lieutenant, with all due respect, that wasn't luck. That was the kind of shooting I see from people with very specific training backgrounds." His voice carried a challenge now, though it remained professional. Several of the other participants were listening to the exchange with obvious interest. Sarah found herself in an increasingly uncomfortable position, caught between maintaining her cover and acknowledging the obvious questions her performance was raising. "I've had some good instructors," she replied diplomatically. Rodriguez studied her for a long moment, then glanced at his clipboard. "According to your file, you're Signal Corps with a specialty in communication systems. That's a pretty significant leap to precision marksmanship at this level." The conversation was attracting more attention from a group. Sarah could feel the weight of everyone's curiosity, and she sensed that Rodriguez was building towards something more than casual questioning. "The Army provides opportunities for cross-training," she said, maintaining her diplomatic approach. "Cross-training." Rodriguez repeated the phrase thoughtfully. "Lieutenant, I've been running advanced marksmanship courses for 8 years. I've trained Rangers, SEALs, Force Recon Marines, and special operations personnel from every branch of the military. What I just watched was beyond cross-training." The challenge in his voice was becoming more apparent. Sarah recognized the dynamic that was developing and realized she might need to address it more directly than she had planned. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Staff Sergeant," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Rodriguez set down his clipboard and crossed his arms. "What I'm suggesting is that your file doesn't match your capabilities. Nobody shoots like that without extensive specialized training. The kind of training that doesn't usually appear in a Signal Corps officer's background." The implied accusation was clear, though Rodriguez was being careful to maintain professional boundaries. Sarah could see that her options were becoming limited. She could continue to deflect, which would only increase suspicion, or she could reveal enough about her background to satisfy Rodriguez's curiosity without compromising operational security. Before she could respond, Rodriguez continued, "You know what? Let's make this interesting. I'm curious to see just how good this Signal Corps training really is." He walked over to the equipment rack and retrieved a rifle that Sarah hadn't seen used during the day's exercises. It was an older model M14, equipped with iron sights rather than a scope. The weapon looked well-maintained but clearly dated compared to the modern precision rifles they had been using. "This was my grandfather's rifle," Rodriguez announced to the group. "He carried it in Vietnam. It's been re-barreled and accurized, but it's still fundamentally a 50-year-old design. No scope, no modern conveniences." He held the rifle out towards Sarah. "Think your Signal Corps training can handle a real marksman's weapon?" The challenge was unmistakable now. Rodriguez was essentially calling her out in front of the entire group, questioning both her background and her abilities. Sarah realized that deflecting any further would only make the situation worse. "What did you have in mind, Staff Sergeant?" she asked, accepting the M14. Rodriguez pointed toward the range. "There's a target at 600 meters. Iron sights only. Think you can hit it?" The other participants had formed a semicircle around them, clearly sensing that something significant was happening. Sarah examined the M14, noting its weight and balance. The rifle was indeed well-maintained, and despite its age, she could tell it had been carefully accurized for precision shooting. 600 meters with iron sights is challenging with any rifle, she observed. "It is," Rodriguez agreed, "especially for someone whose primary specialty is communications equipment." The comment drew some uncomfortable chuckles from the group. Sarah realized that Rodriguez was using her apparent reluctance to accept the challenge as validation of his skepticism about her background. She looked down the range toward the 600-meter target, barely visible even with the spotting scope. Making the shot with iron sights would require exceptional skill and considerable experience with the M14 platform. It was exactly the kind of challenge that would reveal whether her marksmanship skills were genuine or simply the result of favorable conditions and modern equipment. "One shot?" she asked. "One shot," Rodriguez confirmed. "But let's make it interesting. If you miss, you acknowledge that maybe your file accurately reflects your actual training background. If you hit," he paused, clearly not expecting her to accept the challenge. "If you hit, I'll apologize for questioning your credentials." Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention. She knew that accepting the challenge would likely reveal far more about her background than she had intended. At the same time, backing down would validate Rodriguez's skepticism and potentially undermine her credibility for the remainder of the course. "All right," she said simply. "One shot." The group moved to positions where they could observe both Sarah's shooting position and the distant target through spotting scopes. Rodriguez set up behind his scope, clearly confident that he was about to prove his point about the disconnect between Sarah's file and her performance. Sarah approached the firing line and examined the M14 more carefully. The rifle was indeed expertly maintained, with a trigger that felt crisp and consistent. She worked the bolt to get a feel for the action, then settled into a prone position. Through the iron sights, the 600-meter target was barely visible as a small black dot against the lighter background. There was no magnification to help her aim, no scope reticle to assist with wind calculations. Success would depend entirely on her ability to read conditions and make precise adjustments using only the basic iron sight system. The wind was gusty and variable, requiring her to time her shot during a period of relative calm. Atmospheric conditions were creating mirage effects that would shift the apparent position of the target. Most challenging of all, the iron sights provided no reference points for calculating the precise holdover needed for a 600-meter shot. Sarah settled behind the rifle and began her calculations. Years of training with similar weapons under far more challenging conditions had taught her to make these adjustments instinctively. She waited for the wind to settle, found her natural respiratory pause, and gently pressed the trigger. The M14 barked, its distinctive sound echoing across the range. Through his spotting scope, Rodriguez studied the distant target intently. The seconds stretched out as he examined the target through maximum magnification. Finally, he looked up from the scope, his expression a mixture of surprise and something approaching respect. "Dead center hit," he announced to the group. The reaction was immediate. Several participants whistled in appreciation, while others simply stared in disbelief. Webb the SEAL shook his head slowly. "That was an incredible shot," he said. 600 meters with iron sights in these conditions? That's exceptional shooting by any standard. Rodriguez remained behind the spotting scope for several more seconds, as if confirming his initial assessment. When he finally stood up, his demeanor had changed completely. The skepticism was gone, replaced by professional respect and obvious curiosity. "That was outstanding marksmanship," he said, his voice carrying a note of genuine appreciation. "I owe you an apology for questioning your credentials." Sarah nodded acknowledgement of the apology while handing the M14 back to Rodriguez. She could see that her demonstration had answered some questions while raising many others. The performance had been too good to dismiss as luck or basic training, but she wasn't ready to provide the explanations that would satisfy everyone's curiosity. "Thank you for letting me shoot your grandfather's rifle," she said diplomatically. "It's a fine weapon." Rodriguez accepted the rifle, but continued studying Sarah with obvious interest. "Lieutenant, I have to ask again, what's your actual background? That shot suggests training and experience that goes well beyond anything in your official file." The question hung in the air as the group waited for Sarah's response. She realized that her cover was essentially blown, and that continuing to deflect would only create more suspicion. At the same time, revealing her actual specialization could create complications she wasn't prepared to handle. Before she could formulate a response, Rodriguez made a decision that would escalate the situation beyond anything either of them had anticipated. "You know what?" he said, his voice carrying a new edge. "I think we need to find out exactly what kind of training produces shooting like this. Tomorrow morning, we're going to set up a real challenge, something that will show us all what signal corps training can really accomplish." The implication was clear. Rodriguez wasn't satisfied with her demonstration, and he intended to continue pushing until he got the answers he was looking for. Sarah realized that she had won the immediate challenge, but had inadvertently set up a confrontation that could prove far more revealing than anything that had happened so far. As the group began preparing to leave the range, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that Rodriguez's challenge for the following morning would push the situation well beyond the bounds of a simple training exercise. His pride had been stung by her successful shot, and she sensed that he was planning something that would either vindicate his skepticism or force her to reveal capabilities she had worked hard to keep hidden. The next morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that seemed to mirror the tension Sarah felt as she approached the firing range. Word of the previous day's iron sight demonstration had apparently spread, because she noticed several additional personnel gathered around the range facilities who hadn't been part of the original course. Rodriguez had clearly been talking about their exchange, and Sarah suspected that what he had planned for today would be more public than she was comfortable with. She arrived early to find Rodriguez already setting up equipment at various points along the range. His movements were deliberate and systematic, suggesting he had put considerable thought into whatever challenge he was preparing. When he noticed her approach, his expression shifted to something between professional courtesy and anticipation. "Good morning, Lieutenant," he called out. "Ready for today's exercises?" "Looking forward to it," Sarah replied, though her tone carried a note of caution. Rodriguez had indeed been busy since the previous afternoon. Through informal conversations with other instructors and some discreet checking of training records, he had tried to piece together more information about Sarah's background. What he had discovered only deepened the mystery. Her official records showed the expected Signal Corps training along with standard officer development courses, but there were gaps, periods of time, when her location and training activities were not clearly documented. More telling were the comments he had gathered from other instructors. Several mentioned her name in connection with advanced courses they couldn't quite remember her attending, or recalled seeing her at facilities typically reserved for special operations training. The picture that emerged was of someone whose official record didn't match the informal knowledge various instructors had about her capabilities. As the original course participants arrived, they were joined by a handful of additional personnel who had heard about the previous day's demonstration. Among them was Master Sergeant James Crawford, a Marine Scout sniper instructor whose reputation extended well beyond Fort Bragg. His presence suggested that word of Sarah's shooting had reached people with their own questions about her background. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rodriguez announced once everyone had gathered. "Yesterday's exercises raised some interesting questions about training standards and capabilities. Today, we're going to explore those questions in more detail." Sarah immediately recognized that Rodriguez had moved beyond professional curiosity into something approaching a public challenge. The presence of Crawford and the other observers indicated that this had become about more than just marksmanship training. "We're going to conduct what I call a comprehensive skills assessment," Rodriguez continued. "This will test not just marksmanship, but the kind of field craft and tactical thinking that separates recreational shooters from combat professionals." He gestured toward several stations he had set up along the range. "The assessment includes target identification under stress, range estimation without mechanical aids, shooting from improvised positions, and engagement of multiple targets under time pressure. These are skills that take years to develop and can't be mastered through casual training." Sarah studied the course layout, recognizing that Rodriguez had designed something specifically intended to expose any gaps in her training. Each station would require not just accurate shooting, but the kind of fieldcraft knowledge that came only from extensive specialized training or combat experience. Master Sergeant Crawford stepped forward to address the group. "I've been asked to observe this assessment and provide an independent evaluation of performance standards." His presence added an official weight to the proceedings that made Sarah increasingly uncomfortable. "The course begins with target identification," Rodriguez explained, pointing to the first station. "Participants will observe a scenario through binoculars and identify legitimate military targets while avoiding civilian personnel. Wrong identification results in immediate disqualification." The scenario was displayed on a large screen that showed a complex scene with multiple figures in various types of clothing and equipment. Some were clearly military personnel, others were obviously civilians, and several were ambiguous enough to require careful analysis. Station 2 requires range estimation to multiple targets without the use of range-finding equipment, Rodriguez continued. "Accuracy within 5% is required for advancement." Sarah recognized this as a skill that was rarely taught outside of sniper schools or special operations training. Accurate range estimation required not just training, but considerable field experience under various conditions. Station 3 tests shooting from unconventional positions under time pressure. Station 4 requires engagement of multiple targets that appear and disappear at random intervals. The final station tests ballistic knowledge and the ability to make complex calculations without electronic assistance. As Rodriguez described each challenge, Sarah realized that he had essentially created a condensed version of advanced sniper training. Success would require exactly the kind of specialized knowledge he suspected she possessed, but couldn't explain through her official background. "Who would like to go first?" Rodriguez asked. Bradley, the ranger, volunteered to demonstrate the course. His performance was solid, but not exceptional. He correctly identified most of the targets in the first scenario, but missed one ambiguous case that required close analysis. His range estimation was close, but not precise enough to meet the 5% standard. The shooting portions challenged him significantly, and he struggled with the ballistic calculations required at the final station. "Good effort," Crawford commented as Bradley completed the course. "That's about what I'd expect from someone with standard infantry training and some additional marksmanship instruction." Webb, the SEAL, performed better than Bradley, but still struggled with several aspects of the course. His target identification was excellent, and his shooting was accurate, but like Bradley, he found the ballistic calculations challenging. One by one, the other participants attempted the course with varying degrees of success. None achieved what Rodriguez and Crawford clearly considered a satisfactory performance across all stations. Finally, it was Sarah's turn. She approached the first station and studied the target identification scenario through the provided binoculars. The scene was complex, designed to test not just visual acuity, but knowledge of threat indicators and rules of engagement. Sarah identified each target systematically, noting details that others had missed and correctly categorizing several ambiguous figures that had confused previous participants. "Perfect score on target identification," Crawford announced, making notes on his evaluation form. At the range estimation station, Sarah studied each target through binoculars, using terrain features and visual reference points to calculate distances. Her estimates were accurate within 2% for all targets, while exceeding the required standard. The shooting stations presented no significant challenges. Sarah engaged targets from awkward positions with the same accuracy she had demonstrated the previous day. The multiple target engagement scenario, which had challenged every previous participant, seemed almost routine for her. The final station required complex ballistic calculations involving atmospheric conditions, bullet trajectory, and target movement. Sarah worked through the problems with an ease that suggested extensive familiarity with such calculations. "Perfect score across all stations," Crawford announced when Sarah completed the course. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Rodriguez stared at his clipboard, clearly processing what he had just witnessed. Crawford studied Sarah with obvious professional interest. "Lieutenant Chun," Crawford said finally, "that was an exceptional performance. In fact, it's the kind of performance I typically see only from graduates of our most advanced sniper schools." Sarah realized that her cover was now completely blown. There was no way to explain her performance through standard training or lucky circumstances. She faced a choice between continuing her increasingly implausible deflections or acknowledging capabilities she had worked to keep hidden. Before she could respond, Rodriguez stepped forward with an expression that combined frustration with growing anger. "All right, I've had enough of this game," he said, his voice carrying a hard edge that hadn't been present before. "Lieutenant, your performance makes it clear that your official background is incomplete at best or deliberately misleading at worst. I want to know what your real training background is, and I want to know now." The challenge was now completely open, witnessed by more than a dozen military personnel, including Crawford, whose presence gave the confrontation an official weight that Sarah couldn't ignore. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Staff Sergeant," she replied, maintaining her diplomatic approach despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. Rodriguez's frustration finally boiled over. "What I'm suggesting is that you've been lying about your background from the beginning. Nobody performs like this without extensive sniper training, and that's not something that appears in Signal Corps career progression." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge thrown down in front of witnesses. Sarah felt the weight of everyone's attention and realized that the situation had moved beyond professional disagreement into something approaching a confrontation. Crawford intervened before Sarah could respond. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I think we need to approach this more systematically. Lieutenant Chun, would you be willing to discuss your training background more specifically?" Sarah recognized that Crawford was offering her a way to address the situation without escalating the confrontation, but she also knew that any detailed explanation would reveal information she wasn't authorized to share. "Master Sergeant, my training record accurately reflects my qualifications for this course," she said carefully. Rodriguez stepped closer, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Your training record is clearly incomplete or falsified. No Signal Corps officer develops these capabilities without specialized training that would be documented." "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," Crawford warned, his voice carrying authority. "You're making accusations that require substantiation." But Rodriguez was beyond listening to warnings about proper procedure. His professional pride had been challenged, his expertise questioned, and his ability to evaluate personnel called into doubt. In front of witnesses that included his peers and superiors, he felt compelled to press the issue regardless of consequences. "Fine," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Let's settle this definitively. Lieutenant Shun, if your Signal Corps training is as comprehensive as you claim, then you shouldn't have any problem with one more demonstration." He walked to the equipment rack and selected a rifle Sarah hadn't seen before, a custom precision rifle with an extremely high-powered scope. The weapon was clearly Rodriguez's personal equipment, maintained to standards that exceeded even military specifications. "This is my competition rifle," Rodriguez announced to the group. "I use it for 1,000-yard competitions, and I've never been beaten by anyone who wasn't a professional sniper." He pointed to a barely visible target at the extreme range of the facility. "That target is at 1,100 yards. It's a shot that requires not just marksmanship skills, but extensive knowledge of ballistics, atmospheric conditions, and equipment capabilities. The kind of knowledge that takes years to develop." Sarah studied the distant target through binoculars, recognizing immediately that Rodriguez had chosen a shot at the absolute limit of most shooters' capabilities. At 1,100 yards, even small errors in calculation or execution would result in complete misses. "One shot," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "If you make the shot, I'll acknowledge that Signal Corps training is apparently more comprehensive than I realized. If you miss—" He paused, allowing the implication to hang in the air. Sarah realized that Rodriguez had backed both of them into a corner from which neither could retreat without significant loss of face. Refusing the challenge would validate his skepticism about her background. Accepting it would likely require her to reveal capabilities that would raise questions she couldn't answer. "What's the specific challenge?" she asked, buying time to consider her options. Rodriguez smiled grimly. "Center hit on that target. One shot, no practice rounds, current conditions. Miss by more than 2 inches, and you acknowledge that your background doesn't support the capabilities you've demonstrated." The gauntlet was now completely thrown down. Crawford looked concerned about the direction the confrontation was taking, but his position as observer limited his ability to intervene. The other participants watched with obvious fascination, sensing that they were witnessing something that would be discussed long after the training course ended. Sarah looked at the distant target one more time, calculating wind conditions, atmospheric factors, and the ballistic characteristics of Rodriguez's rifle. The shot was challenging, but well within her capabilities. The question was whether making it would create more problems than missing it. Rodriguez interpreted her hesitation as doubt about her abilities. "Having second thoughts about that Signal Corps training," he said, his tone carrying unmistakable mockery. The comment drew uncomfortable chuckles from some observers, and Sarah realized that Rodriguez had successfully maneuvered the situation to a point where backing down would be seen as admission of incompetence or deception. "Wrong gun, sweetheart," Rodriguez added, his voice carrying a condescending edge that made several observers wince. "This isn't some basic training rifle. This requires real expertise." The comment was the final straw. Sarah had endured Rodriguez's skepticism and challenged his assumptions without losing her temper, but his condescending tone and the implied insult crossed a line she wasn't prepared to accept. "Let me see the rifle," she said quietly. As Rodriguez handed her his prized weapon, neither of them realized that the next few minutes would fundamentally change how everyone present viewed both of their capabilities and judgment. Sarah accepted Rodriguez's custom rifle with the same careful attention she had shown to every weapon throughout the course. The rifle was indeed exceptional, a precision-built platform that represented thousands of dollars in modifications and customization. The scope alone probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and every component had been selected for maximum accuracy. As she examined the weapon, Sarah became aware of the absolute silence that had fallen over the range. Even the distant sounds of other training activities seemed muted, as if the entire facility was holding its breath. Crawford had moved to a position where he could observe both Sarah's shooting position and the distant target through a high-powered spotting scope. Rodriguez stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mixture of confidence and anticipation. He had chosen this particular challenge carefully, selecting conditions that would test the absolute limits of marksmanship skill. The 1,100-yard target was at the extreme range of the facility, positioned in an area where wind patterns were notoriously difficult to read and atmospheric conditions created maximum challenge for long-range shooting. "The rifle is zeroed at 100 yards, Rodriguez informed her, his tone now carrying professional courtesy mixed with underlying skepticism. "You'll need to calculate holdover for the distance, adjust for current wind conditions, and account for atmosphere pressure. The scope has target turrets, but you'll need to know how to use them." Sarah nodded acknowledgement while continuing her examination of the rifle. The weapon felt balanced and well-maintained, with a trigger that broke cleanly at what felt like approximately 2 pounds. She cycled the bolt to get a feel for the action, noting that Rodriguez had indeed invested in quality components throughout. Through the scope, she could see the distant target as a small, but clearly defined circle. The magnification was sufficient to allow precise aiming, but at 1,100 yards, even the highest quality optics couldn't eliminate all the challenges associated with atmospheric distortion and environmental conditions. Sarah studied the wind flags positioned at various distances along the range, noting how the wind patterns changed at different ranges. Near the firing line, flags indicated a light breeze from the left. At intermediate distances, the wind appeared stronger and more variable. At the target, barely visible indicators suggested swirling conditions that would make precise wind calculation extremely difficult. She had faced similar challenges countless times during her actual deployments, often under conditions that made the current scenario seem simple by comparison. Enemy fire, time pressure, and the knowledge that missing could mean the difference between mission success and failure had taught her to make these calculations quickly and accurately. But this wasn't a combat situation. This was a public challenge where missing would vindicate Rodriguez's skepticism about her background, while hitting would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. The political implications of the shot were almost as challenging as the technical aspects. "Take your time," Rodriguez said, though his tone suggested he believed she was stalling because the shot was beyond her capabilities. "It's a challenging shot, even for someone with proper training." The condescending comment reminded Sarah why she had accepted this challenge in the first place. Rodriguez's attitude had moved beyond professional skepticism into personal disrespect, and his "wrong gun, sweetheart" comment had crossed a line that demanded response. She settled into a prone position behind the rifle, adjusting her body position for maximum stability. Through the scope, she began her calculations systematically, processing wind speed, direction changes at various ranges, atmospheric pressure, and temperature effects on bullet trajectory. The mathematics involved were complex, requiring her to mentally calculate bullet drop, wind drift, and timing factors without electronic assistance. These were skills that had been drilled into her through hundreds of hours of training and refined through real-world application under combat conditions. At 1,100 yards, a .308 Winchester bullet would drop approximately 400 inches below the line of sight, requiring significant scope adjustment or holdover calculation. Wind effects would push the bullet several feet left or right, depending on conditions along the entire flight path. Temperature and atmospheric pressure would affect both bullet velocity and trajectory in ways that required precise compensation. Sarah made her scope adjustments methodically, turning the elevation and windage turrets based on her calculations. She could hear Rodriguez behind her, probably expecting her to ask for guidance or assistance with the complex shot preparation. Instead, she settled behind the rifle and began her final preparations. Through the scope, she could see heat mirage rising from the ground at various distances, creating optical distortion that would affect her point of aim. She waited for the atmospheric conditions to settle, timing her shot for a moment when mirage effects would be minimized. The wind patterns were the most challenging variable. At 1,100 yards, the bullet would be in flight for approximately 1.3 seconds, during which time wind conditions could change significantly. Sarah watched the flags at various distances, looking for a pattern that would allow her to predict wind effects along the entire bullet path. Behind her, she could hear quiet conversations among the observers. Someone mentioned that Rodriguez had never seen anyone take this much time preparing for the shot, suggesting that most people either rushed the attempt or declined the challenge entirely. Crawford's voice cut through the murmurs. "Lieutenant Shun, whenever you're ready. No pressure, but we do have other training scheduled for this afternoon." Sarah acknowledged with a slight nod, but continued her preparations. She had learned long ago that rushing precision shots led to misses, and the current stakes were too high to accept anything less than perfect execution. Finally, conditions aligned in her favor. The wind had settled into a relatively consistent pattern, atmospheric distortion was minimal, and lighting conditions were optimal. Sarah settled behind the rifle and found her natural respiratory pause. Through the scope, the target appeared crisp and clear. She had calculated her holdover and windage adjustments, accounted for all environmental factors, and prepared for the shot as thoroughly as conditions allowed. Now it was simply a matter of execution. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. Through the scope, Sarah watched the bullet's trace as it arced toward the distant target. At 1,100 yards, even a fast bullet took noticeable time to reach its destination, and she could actually follow its flight path through the scope. The impact was clearly visible through the high magnification optics. Sarah remained behind the rifle for a moment, confirming her assessment of the shot placement before stepping back to allow others to verify the result. Crawford immediately moved to his spotting scope and began examining the target. The seconds stretched out as he studied the impact point through maximum magnification. Rodriguez stood beside him, clearly anxious about the results, but trying to maintain professional composure. Well, someone called out from the group of observers. Crawford remained behind the scope for what felt like an eternity before finally looking up. His expression was unreadable as he turned toward the group. "Perfect center hit," he announced clearly. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several observers whistled in appreciation, while others simply stared in disbelief. Webb, the SEAL who had been consistently impressed by Sarah's shooting, shook his head slowly. 1,100 yards with one shot, he said quietly. "That's exceptional marksmanship by any standard." Rodriguez stood frozen beside the spotting scope, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. He had been confident that the shot was beyond Sarah's capabilities, regardless of her impressive performance on the previous challenges. The 1,100-yard shot was supposed to expose the limitations of her training, not demonstrate capabilities that exceeded even his own. Crawford continued studying the target through his scope, as if confirming his initial assessment. "Not just a center hit," he added. "That bullet struck within an inch of absolute center. That's precision shooting of the highest caliber." Sarah handed the rifle back to Rodriguez, noting that his hands trembled slightly as he accepted the weapon. His confidence had been completely shattered, and his public challenge had backfired in the most dramatic way possible. "Thank you for letting me use your rifle," she said quietly. "It's an exceptional weapon." Rodriguez accepted the rifle, but seemed unable to formulate a response. His entire assessment of the situation had been proven wrong in front of witnesses that included his peers and superiors. The shot Sarah had just made was beyond anything he had achieved himself, despite years of competitive shooting and advanced training. Crawford approached Sarah with obvious professional interest. "Lieutenant, that was an outstanding demonstration of marksmanship skill. I have to say, that's the kind of shooting I associate with our most advanced sniper training programs." Before Sarah could respond, Rodriguez finally found his voice. However, instead of the gracious acknowledgement that might have been expected, his words carried a note of desperation that surprised everyone present. "Lucky shot," he said, though his tone suggested he didn't believe his own words. Environmental conditions must have been favorable. The comment drew uncomfortable glances from the observers. Even those without extensive marksmanship experience could recognize that a 1,100-yard center hit wasn't the result of luck or favorable conditions. Crawford's expression hardened noticeably. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, that comment is inappropriate and unprofessional. What we just witnessed was exceptional marksmanship that demonstrates extensive training and experience." But Rodriguez was beyond rational assessment of the situation. His professional reputation had been challenged, his expertise questioned, and his judgment proven wrong in the most public way possible. Instead of accepting the results gracefully, he seemed determined to find some way to salvage his position. "I want to see her do it again," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made several observers step back. "Anyone can get lucky once. Let's see if Signal Corps training can repeat that performance." The demand was clearly unreasonable. Asking someone to repeat a perfect 1,100-yard shot as proof of skill moved beyond professional evaluation into something approaching harassment. Crawford's expression suggested he was reaching the limit of his patience with Rodriguez's behavior. Sarah realized that Rodriguez's pride had been so thoroughly damaged that he was no longer thinking clearly. His public challenge had backfired completely, but instead of accepting the results gracefully, he was doubling down on his skepticism in ways that were becoming increasingly unprofessional. "Staff Sergeant," she said quietly, "I think we've established that the shot was within my capabilities." "Have we?" Rodriguez replied, his voice rising slightly. "Or have we established that environmental conditions allowed for a lucky shot that can't be repeated?" Crawford stepped forward, his expression making clear that the situation had moved beyond acceptable bounds. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, that's enough. Lieutenant Chun has demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills that speak for themselves." But Rodriguez was past the point where rational intervention could salvage his position. The humiliation of being proven wrong so dramatically had triggered a reaction that surprised even him with its intensity. "Fine," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "If her training is as comprehensive as she claims, then she won't mind one final demonstration." He walked to the equipment rack and selected another rifle, his backup precision weapon that he normally reserved for the most challenging shots. His movements were jerky and aggressive, suggesting that his emotional state was affecting his professional judgment. "One more shot," he announced to the group. Different rifle, different target, prove that this isn't just equipment familiarity or environmental luck. Sarah realized that Rodriguez had moved completely beyond rational evaluation into something approaching a personal vendetta. His professional credibility was now tied to proving that her performance was somehow illegitimate, regardless of evidence to the contrary. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple training exercise, and Sarah sensed that the next few minutes would determine not just the immediate outcome of the confrontation, but potentially the future careers of everyone involved. Crawford had seen enough. As Rodriguez reached for his backup rifle with hands that were visibly shaking from emotion, the master sergeant stepped between him and the equipment rack with an authority that brooked no argument. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, stand down immediately," Crawford commanded, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "This exercise is terminated." Rodriguez froze, the backup rifle halfway out of the rack. The absolute silence that followed Crawford's order made it clear that everyone present understood they were witnessing a career-defining moment for the Marine instructor. "Master Sergeant, I just want to verify," Rodriguez began. "You want to verify nothing," Crawford cut him off sharply. "What you want to do is salvage your wounded pride by continuing to challenge an officer whose capabilities you consistently underestimated. That's not professional evaluation. That's personal harassment." The words hit Rodriguez like physical blows. His face flushed red as the reality of his situation became clear. In front of more than a dozen witnesses, including his peers and superiors, he had allowed his ego to override his professional judgment to such an extent that a Marine Master Sergeant was publicly reprimanding him. Crawford turned to address the entire group, his voice carrying formal authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this exercise is concluded. Lieutenant Chun has demonstrated exceptional marksmanship skills that speak for themselves. Any questions about her capabilities have been definitively answered." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. While Crawford's intervention had ended the immediate confrontation, she realized that her performance had raised questions that wouldn't be easily dismissed. A Signal Corps officer didn't develop sniper-level skills through routine training, and several people present clearly understood the implications. Webb approached her as the group began to disperse. "Lieutenant, that was incredible shooting. I've worked with some of the best marksmen in the Navy, and what you demonstrated today ranks with anything I've ever seen." "Thank you," Sarah replied diplomatically. It was a challenging course. Bradley joined the conversation, his expression thoughtful. "Lieutenant Chun, I have to ask, where exactly did you receive advanced marksmanship training? That level of precision doesn't come from standard military courses." Sarah realized that while Crawford had ended Rodriguez's harassment, the questions about her background weren't going away. If anything, her dramatic demonstration had made it impossible to maintain her low-profile approach. "I've been fortunate to receive some additional training opportunities," she said, maintaining her diplomatic approach. Crawford approached the small group, his expression serious. "Lieutenant Chun, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" As they moved away from the others, Crawford's demeanor shifted from formal authority to professional curiosity. "Lieutenant, I need to ask you directly, What's your actual background? That shooting demonstration was beyond anything I see from conventional military training. Sarah had been dreading this moment throughout the entire exercise. Crawford's position and experience meant that deflecting his questions would be both difficult and potentially counterproductive. Master Sergeant, my training record accurately reflects my qualifications, she said carefully. Crawford studied her for a long moment. Lieutenant, I've been training military marksmen for 15 years. I've worked with graduates from every sniper school in the military. What you demonstrated today suggests training and experience that doesn't appear in conventional career paths. Before Sarah could respond, Crawford continued, I'm not trying to create problems for you, but I am responsible for evaluating training standards and capabilities. If there are advanced programs producing this level of marksmanship, I need to understand how they work. Sarah realized that Crawford's interest was professional rather than suspicious. Unlike Rodriguez's ego-driven challenge, Crawford was trying to understand legitimate training questions raised by her performance. Master Sergeant, some training programs aren't widely publicized for operational security reasons, she said carefully. I'm sure you understand that certain specializations require discretion. Crawford's expression shifted to one of understanding. I see. Special operations background. Sarah neither confirmed nor denied the implication, but her silence was answer enough for someone with Crawford's experience. That explains a great deal, Crawford said quietly. Lieutenant, you have my apologies for today's situation. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez allowed his personal feelings to override his professional judgment, and you shouldn't have been put in that position. Thank you, Master Sergeant. I appreciate your intervention. Crawford glanced back toward Rodriguez, who was standing alone by the equipment rack, clearly struggling with the implications of his behavior. Lieutenant, I need to ask you to maintain discretion about your background. If you're special operations trained, there are probably security considerations I don't need to know about. I understand completely. Good. And Lieutenant. Crawford's expression became more serious. For what it's worth, that was some of the finest marksmanship I've ever witnessed. Whatever program trained you, they did exceptional work. As Crawford walked away, Sarah felt both relief and concern. Her cover was essentially blown, but at least it was blown to someone who understood the need for operational security. The question now was how to handle the other observers who clearly had questions about her background. She returned to the main group to find Rodriguez standing apart from the others, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and barely controlled anger. The other participants were engaged in animated discussions about the shooting demonstration, but they fell silent as she approached. Lieutenant Chun, Webb said carefully, I think I speak for everyone when I say that was an impressive demonstration. Whatever training program produced those skills is clearly exceptional. The others nodded agreement, but their expression suggested they understood there was more to her background than she was revealing. Sarah realized that maintaining complete secrecy was no longer possible, but she could still control how much information she shared. The military provides opportunities for specialized training, she said. I've been fortunate to participate in some advanced programs. Bradley smiled knowingly. I think we all understand that some programs aren't widely advertised. No questions asked. The implicit agreement from the group was a relief. These were all experienced military personnel who understood that certain training and capabilities weren't discussed publicly. They were willing to respect her privacy while acknowledging her demonstrated skills. Rodriguez finally approached the group, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked like resignation. Lieutenant Chun, he said quietly, I owe you a formal apology. My behavior today was unprofessional and inappropriate. Sarah studied his expression, seeing genuine remorse alongside the embarrassment. Apology accepted, Staff Sergeant. I'll let my personal feelings override my professional judgment, Rodriguez continued. That was wrong, and I'm sorry you were subjected to that kind of harassment. Crawford rejoined the group in time to hear Rodriguez's apology. Staff Sergeant, I appreciate you taking responsibility for your actions. However, there will need to be a formal review of today's events. Rodriguez nodded acceptance, clearly understanding that his career had been significantly damaged by his behavior. Public harassment of a fellow instructor, particularly one who had demonstrated superior capabilities, was not something that would be overlooked by his superiors. Lieutenant Chun, Crawford addressed the group formally. On behalf of the Advanced Combat Marksmanship course, I want to thank you for your participation. Your performance has been exceptional by any standard. As the formal training day concluded, the participants began gathering their equipment and preparing to leave. Several approached Sarah individually to express their appreciation for her shooting demonstration and to acknowledge, in carefully diplomatic terms, their understanding that her background included training they weren't supposed to know about. Webb lingered as the others departed. "Lieutenant, I don't know what program you came from, but I hope our paths cross again under better circumstances. That was some of the most impressive shooting I've ever witnessed." "Thank you. It's been an educational experience." After Webb left, Sarah found herself alone with her equipment, processing the events of the past 2 days. Her attempt to maintain a low profile during the course had been completely unsuccessful, but the outcome could have been much worse. Crawford's intervention had prevented the situation from escalating further, and Rodriguez's eventual apology had restored some level of professionalism to the proceedings. As she prepared to leave the range, Rodriguez approached her one final time. His earlier aggression was completely gone, replaced by what appeared to be genuine professional respect. "Lieutenant, I wanted to say something more personal," he said quietly. "I've been teaching marksmanship for 8 years, and I thought I understood the full spectrum of military shooting capabilities. What you demonstrated today was beyond anything I believed was possible." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but remained silent. "I realize now that there are levels of training and experience I don't fully understand," Rodriguez continued. "My grandfather would have been impressed by that shot with his rifle. He always said the mark of a true marksman was making the difficult shots look easy." "Your grandfather's rifle is a fine weapon," Sarah replied. "It was an honor to shoot it." Rodriguez managed a slight smile. "I think he would have liked you. He always said that the most dangerous person on any battlefield was the one nobody expected." As Rodriguez walked away, Sarah reflected on the unexpected wisdom in his final comment. Her entire military career had been built around being the person nobody expected, the quiet Signal Corps officer whose unassuming appearance masked specialized capabilities that few people knew existed. The Advanced Combat Marksmanship course had tested more than just her shooting skills. It had challenged her ability to maintain operational security while demonstrating the capabilities necessary to maintain credibility. The balance between revealing too much and revealing too little had proven more difficult than any of the actual marksmanship challenges. As she gathered her equipment and prepared to leave Fort Bragg, Sarah considered the lessons learned over the past 2 days. The most important lesson had nothing to do with shooting techniques or ballistic calculations. Instead, it was about the importance of maintaining professional composure under pressure and the dangers of allowing personal pride to override professional judgment. Rodriguez's behavior had provided a clear example of what happened when ego became more important than evaluation, when personal validation took precedence over professional development. His public humiliation had been entirely self-inflicted, the result of pushing a confrontation beyond reasonable bounds. For Sarah, the experience had reinforced the importance of remaining true to her training and capabilities regardless of external pressure. The temptation to back down from Rodriguez's challenges had been strong, particularly given her desire to maintain a low profile. But allowing his skepticism to go unanswered would have validated assumptions that were both wrong and professionally damaging. The "wrong gun, sweetheart" comment that had triggered her final demonstration would likely become the defining moment of the entire course. Rodriguez's condescending attitude had revealed assumptions about gender and capability that his subsequent apology couldn't completely erase. Sarah's response had demonstrated that expertise transcended appearances and that underestimating people based on superficial characteristics was a mistake that could have serious consequences. As she drove away from Fort Bragg, Sarah reflected on the irony that her attempt to participate quietly in an advanced training course had resulted in one of the most public demonstrations of her capabilities in years. The story would undoubtedly spread throughout the military marksmanship community, adding to her reputation in ways she hadn't planned but couldn't entirely regret. Crawford's understanding of her background and his commitment to maintaining operational security provided some reassurance that the security implications would be managed appropriately. But she also knew that the dramatic nature of the day's events made it impossible to return to complete anonymity. The next morning would bring new challenges and new opportunities to balance her specialized capabilities with the requirements of her official position. But for now, she was satisfied that she had maintained both her professional standards and her personal integrity under circumstances that had tested both in ways she hadn't anticipated. Rodriguez's final apology had demonstrated that even damaged professional relationships could be repaired through honesty and accountability. His recognition that there were levels of expertise he didn't fully understand showed a professional maturity that his earlier behavior had not suggested. The advanced combat marksmanship course had ended very differently than either Sarah or Rodriguez had anticipated when they first met on the firing range. But the lessons learned about capability, respect, and professional conduct would likely influence both of their careers for years to come. Sometimes the most important training happened not during formal instruction, but in the moments when personal and professional values were tested under pressure.